Hi, I'm Meta Spencer, and today we're going to Mexico City for one thing, and we're going to Montreal, and we may go to Geneva. But I'm not so sure because the Geneva guy hasn't shown up yet. This is a schmooze day. Some of you may know that on schmooze days, I don't have an agenda. So I never know what people are going to talk about. I just put together some interesting people that I think should know each other and try to put them together and see what happens. So today, what we have, you will have an opportunity to meet Aaron Tovish, who's just joined us. He's in Mexico City in the Swedish embassy to Mexico, because his wife is the ambassador to Mexico, and he is a retired coordinator for Mayors for Peace, who that outfit was based in Hiroshima. In Montreal is Abraham Weisfeld, who is a Montrealer. He's Jewish, but he's anti-Zionist. He's a big-time activist who normally he lives half of the year, and maybe he's going to start living year-round in Nablus, Palestine. Doug Saunders is, you will probably all recognize him if you've been watching this show before, because he seems to he likes these schmooze days. He is the international affairs honcho at the Globe and Mail. Spends a lot of time in Germany, but I guess you're going to go back sometime soon for another stint at that institute, right, Doug?
Hopefully get a few more months of think tanking in later this year and spend some time in some other countries in the vicinity too, in Russia and Sweden and Spain.
I consider Doug sort of like the co-host for this show, because he's always got wonderful things that he brings up to talk about. So why don't we see what's on your mind, Doug? What would you like for these guys to discuss?
So it's a little hard to avoid being a little curious about what's going on in terms of lack of peace in Palestine right now. Abraham, what are you hearing in Nablus?
Access to Palestine is not possible because the pandemic is still raging in the West Bank and Gaza, because Israel didn't consider itself to be responsible for vaccinating the population there, even though they have 3 million doses of the AstraZeneca vaccine in stock. Is that this war on Gaza was essentially ordered by somebody who's not even the prime minister anymore. Netanyahu, has expired his mandate from the president to form a government. So he cannot be a prime minister. He is not presently the prime minister, and yet he ordered a war in Gaza. Israel is sort of a weird country. And that's just one example of how bad it can get.
Let me ask you about the electoral politics behind this, because March was supposed to be a big month. March had an election in Israel that failed to produce a government. And as you point out, means that there's somebody acting as prime minister who doesn't have legitimacy as prime minister. But March, of course, was also supposed to have the first Palestinian election since 2006, which I think people had optimistically hoped would produce a shift away from Hamas and into Fatah. And they may yet happen and so on, but has this attack by Israel caused a shift of sentiments?
Yes,
yeah.
Definitely. The Palestinian election for the legislative authority was supposed to have taken place 2 days ago, but it was suspended by the president. Abbas seems to have sole authority in the Palestinian Authority. And his strategy was that he was making a point out of getting the right to conduct the election in West Jerusalem, and thereby put a stake in the ground, to claim East Jerusalem as part of the Palestine that was designated by the Oslo Interim Agreement. And this was going to make him out to be a big hero, because eventually he expected to win the case against Israel. even though Israel was in effect allowing the election to go ahead, but not allowing the election ballot boxes to be placed in the post offices. Therefore, they could have been placed in Palestinian banks or in other Palestinian establishments, or Palestinians could have just drove down to the suburbs there to go and vote in the Palestinian office. So Abbas was trying to make, a big deal out of this, more of a big deal than it was, and used the ultimate option of suspending the election in order to make the point. But he's trying to ride on the back of the popular uprising that was conducted by the youth, the Shabab, as they're called, at the Damascus Gate, where previously there was, free free transit, free use of the entranceway by the Palestinians, but the Zionist authorities, the military, the police in particular, who are rather aggressive, even more aggressive than the military, were trying to expel the Palestinian youth from congregating in that area. And Abbas was trying to ride on that, Shabab movement. But it didn't work because Hamas decided to jump on top of the horse as well and made a bigger deal out of the matter by coming to the support of the Palestinian youth at the Damascus Gate and the residents of Sheikh Jarrah by launching a counterattack using mortars, which are not rockets, don't have an explosive charge, don't have a guidance system, but nonetheless are treated as such and used as an excuse by Netanyahu to jump on the horse himself and ride, to the authority that he assumes, and resulted in like 253 casualties in the Gaza, and 50,000 people who are now refugees again in Gaza because their homes have been destroyed, together with the pilots who decided to take revenge on the journalists by bombing the journalists' tower there, together with the radio station antennas. And the servers for the internet service in Gaza Strip were also bombed, as well as other infrastructure. So Israel was trying to degrade the political authority of Hamas and its operating capability in its own campaign. So there's a lot of opportunistic interests that are in play here, all of which disregard, the civilian population of Palestinians.
I am curious about how much, if any, well, I think there is some shift in the public opinion globally, but it's really the U.S., of course, that's most important in that the U.S. has been so supportive of the Israeli position up till now. But I certainly hear evidence that there is a change of opinion in the U.S., and I just don't know whether it's enough to make any difference and whether it's reflected globally. Is there any additional movement, for example, in Mexico?
First, I'd like to make a comment based on my experience of working for 14 years with an international network of cities. And that is that what international law says about attacking civilian populations and densely populated areas is being pretty regularly violated. There's an international campaign against the use of wide area explosives in populated areas, which is doing very good work within the UN system among experts and so on, but it's not getting much attention internationally. And then, if Doug will forgive me, I think that the media handles this issue of cities coming under bombardment, be it by Hamas or the Israeli Air Force, handles it very badly. There's nothing like for a great visual opening of a news report to show a big billowing fiery ball of smoke rising up above, an urban neighborhood, or big buildings burning and so forth. And it's rarely, if ever, said that this is a war crime. What's happening with this kind of warfare is criminal. When I worked for Mayors for Peace, we became pretty consistent at condemning attacks of this sort, regardless of the source, regardless of the supposed justifications. And United Cities and local governments also picked up on this. But I haven't seen it happening so consistently lately, or the media simply being negligent about reporting these opinions of city leaders from all over the world. And so, Doug, I challenge you to talk to some of the leading members of Mayors for Peace and United Cities and local governments, which is headquartered in Barcelona, Spain, to get reactions from them and how they feel when they turn on the TV and see these kind of explosions occurring, and the commentators say nothing about the legality or illegality of such attacks.
Getting mayors' views is certainly a good idea. I mean, I would say the illegality of the taxes was the main subject of the reporting last week, and tended to dominate the coverage. I mean, the fact that it violated both international agreements and sort of international law was the outstanding fact about the Israeli response.
Well, I noticed an uptick in that when the Associated Press and Newsweek, and I forget a few others, actually they themselves came under attack. And of course, it's particularly egregious when the media is attacked, as for example happened when NATO attacked in Belgrade. But while I take your point that it's mentioned, I don't think that you're hearing it from city leaders, and that city leaders internationally are very concerned about the low level of respect that's given to a central part of international law.
Yeah, it's partly because I think the comparison of scale is a difficult one, in that municipal leaders do have strong voices in these things. Part of the problem, of course, is that in Gaza there isn't such a thing as a municipal layer. It still does not have a legitimate government. It's an area under Israeli military control. And so you don't have that type of voice, that scale of government on the Palestinian side, at least not in Gaza. West Bank's another matter as far as the structure of government. So
what about the mayor of Toronto?
It's an interesting idea. It would be worth hearing a statement from mayors.
Yeah.
Can you get a statement from mayors, Aaron?
Well, I haven't worked for Mayors for Peace for 4 years now.
I know, but they know who you are.
Yeah, no, I could put the challenge to Hiroshima and Nagasaki and some of the other leading cities, and I could bring it up with Claudia Sheinbaum, the mayor of or governor of Mexico City.
Okay. And then, Avi, what would you do with that if you had a new list of protesters, like 6,000 cities all against what the Israelis are doing to Gaza? Where would you go with that? There are about 6,000 cities in Mayors for Peace, aren't there?
Over 7,000.
7,000. Okay, there you go. Okay, we'll get 7,000 protests for you, Avi. What are you going to do with that?
That would have an effect upon the undecided Jewish opinion. It should be known that there's a great deal of dissident opinion that is now going mainstream, in the Jewish nationalities of various countries against the policies of the governments of Israel. And I'd like to point out to one particular example, a journalist by the name of Peter Beinart,
Yeah.
who writes for Jewish Currents and writes for the Jewish Forward in New York City as well, who is a mainstream journalist and previously was pro-Zionist, has now come out for the right of return of the Palestinian refugees.
Yeah, he's on every TV show you turn on.
And I think the essay that Abraham references, which was in Jewish Currents, which is an important magazine that he's on the editorial board of, was an influence, although maybe not in the way necessarily. It has a different influence in different ways, because of course he pointed out that the two-state solution is politically harder to imagine after a decade of Netanyahu expanding settlements and so on, and pointed out that there's no way you could have a sustainable one-state solution that would be recognizable in international law and moral without giving Palestinians an equal right of return as Israeli Jews have. And he quite eloquently pointed out that they're both populations that are connected to a historic memory of displacement, and that multi-generational sense of displacement is central to national identity in both Palestine and Israel. But for some people, that would be read as being an argument about how you could make a one-state solution work. But I think for a lot of people, and I said this in my column on this topic last week, that I think for a lot of Israeli readers, that essay would be read as making the case of why a one-state solution is impossible, and why abandoning the Middle East peace process, or whatever ruins of it still exist at this point, would still be the worst option, because you would have to consider things like having a parallel and equal right of return. And
yes, I would like to agree with Doug there that the right of return basically makes a one-state solution unfeasible, and the one-state campaign, or the one-state movement, there are two actually blocks of supporters there. Both of them ignore the right of return of the Palestinian refugees, which makes the one-state solution not a solution. On the other hand, the two-state solution is not feasible in the sense of two sovereign states. Both of these proposed solutions are not solutions. And yet both camps tend to ignore, the impasse. They just, focus on the points that make their option somewhat better than the alternative option that is considered. So one has to question the whole constitutional nature of the state itself, because it leads to an impossible solution on either the one hand or the other. So one has to go into a sort of an academic research, goal of finding an alternative that goes beyond the alternatives that have been presented.
So plan A doesn't work, plan B doesn't work, and you have plan C. Is that it?
So over the 3 years that I was writing, in Nablus, when I was living in Nablus, I had to figure out, some other solution. And this is provided to me by the concept that I have inherent in my own sort of political upbringing, since my mother was a Jewish Bundist anti-Zionist from Warsaw, who taught me, and the Bund taught us, that the national cultural autonomy is a necessary concept for minority nationalities to have representation in the constitutional provisions of the country in which they're living. So if one takes national cultural autonomy and applies it in a generalized fashion to both parties and to all parties concerned, one ends up with a federated society, a civil society that is independent of the state. And I elaborated this and explained how it can be done. I haven't mentioned previously that I have a certain diplomatic qualification because I was the chargé d'affaires for the Palestine ambassador to Canada between 1982 and 1985 during the Israel invasion of Lebanon. So I have a certain
Wait a minute, they know your idea? You had an opportunity to try it out on him, and what did he say?
I don't know if Abdullah has had the time to read the book yet, but when I make my proposals, they're treated as legitimate and not, as something that is, an impossibility.
Well, I never heard of anybody but you promote such a thing. So I mean, you're gonna either we're going to talk about it or we're not going to talk about it. If we're going to talk about it, you've got to explain a lot because it's not something anybody else has ever heard of.
Well, start with the nutshell. What's the proposal in a nutshell?
Okay. Now, each population which has their own national identity, of course, have the right to their own national representation, and so they would elect their own government. There would, be a Jewish government, and there would be a Palestinian government, and there would be Jewish people living, amongst the Palestinians, or living in mostly Jewish municipalities such as Tel Aviv, which would have their own municipal government as well, and thus give, a certain identity, governmental identity to the Jewish national identity in such a case on a municipal level, in addition to a governmental representation over the entire territory. This would allow for the return of the refugees, which would make the Palestinians the majority. Now, in a one-state solution, if the question of the return of the Palestinian refugees were to come up, according to liberal democratic theory, majority would decide the matter. However, when the majority would be rather slim, in either one case or the other, either the Jewish, vote would determine that the Palestinians don't have a right of return, or if the Palestinians decided by a slim majority that the Palestinian refugees did have a right of return, this would, obviously break out into a civil war. It's not a solution in and of itself. So how to bring about the right of return of the Palestinian refugees, who now number 7.5 million, whether they return or not, nonetheless, they would be granted citizenship and a vote. So how to achieve this would have to be based upon the principle of the national cultural autonomy. And so there would be governmental independence for the Palestinians, governmental independence for the Jewish Israelis, who are a Hebrew nation, and be a federal council in which each would have to have, I assume there would have to be, 50-50 representation in the federal council, in which, both one and the other, would have a veto power over any fundamental change in that configuration. Then there would have to be constitutional assemblies for each national grouping, and then a constitutional assembly to determine a federal constitution as well. So it's a whole process that I've outlined, with constitutional provisions, with reference to Resolution 181, which allows for such a procedure, which has been outlined by Dr. Uri Davis, who lives in Ramallah and who is a Jewish Palestinian, who is actually on the political commission of the Fatah Council. He's a member of Fatah, as well as Rabbi Moshe Hirsch from the Territorial, who's also in the executive. He's an executive member of the Fatah Council, Fatah Party. So you can see that the process has already gained, some headway amongst those, who are both Jewish and Palestinians, but who are anti-Zionist.
So in short, this is interesting. It's a proposal to have two sovereign nation states defined by ethnic identity, but without any territorial basis.
Yes.
You know what it sounds like to me? I can't help thinking of the millet system in the Ottoman Empire. I can't help thinking of that. Is it? I know you don't like the idea, but isn't it similar, really?
No, because the Jewish people didn't have any government in the millet system. They had only a protected status as a national minority, recognized as such, had to pay a special tax, and were not eligible to have military service. So they had no capacity for self-defense. Supposedly defended by the state and paid for that defense, by the special tax, which ended up not defending them. And there were various riots propagated against the Jewish community, which has nothing compared to the Holocaust, by the Christians of Europe, but nonetheless, didn't offer sufficient protection for the Jewish people, who therefore found it an attractive proposition when invited by the Zionists to go to Palestine, and they did so until they actually formed 70% of the Jewish Israeli population at one point, until the Russian Jewish population immigrated in a number of 2 million. And now the Jewish Arabs, as they should be known as, form 50% of the Israeli Jewish population, which is nonetheless dominated by the Ashkenazi, so-called white population of Europe, who form the core of the Zionist movement. So, it gets more and more complicated as we go along. And, the Mizrahi Sephardim, Jewish Arab population, should also have their Jewish national cultural autonomy and have their own governmental apparatus to deal with the Ashkenazi domination to which they are subjected to.
So it's a little bit more like some of the proposals for indigenous First Nations sovereignty in places like Canada, which would be an ethnic identity defined sovereignty with some territory, but across a wide territorial space. Well, was that one of the things you looked at or talked to in the process of?
It's not the same because when ethnic means national, but the term national is avoided, because the term nation is reserved for states and nation states, which is only endemic, to liberal democratic theory, but it is not necessarily representative of the actuality. So, the national minorities are actually called nationalities, and ethnies or ethnic minority is only used to avoid, the political recognition that such people are a national entity and are living as nationalities within a majoritarian society. So first of all, there's that.
If we can set aside the question of whether there are precedents or similarities elsewhere, I'm trying to look at this from a practical point of view. And it seems to me that in the current heated political atmosphere, thoughtful ideas like yours don't stand a chance. And the major actors, be it Netanyahu or Hamas leaders, would be quite hostile to any serious exploration of this. And so what I'm wondering is whether there could be created a neutral space where people from all the relevant sides could be brought together, shielded from the current, brouhaha, and allowed to work on this in a thoughtful way, but a deliberate way, and at the right moment, come forward with Plan C.
Precisely, that's a constitutional assembly. That's what a constitutional assembly would accomplish. So, but, when I presented my book, and it's titled basically The Federation of Palestinian and Hebrew Nations, when I presented that to the Palestinians, all the Palestinians that I spoke to about it agreed immediately. So from the bottom up, it's feasible. Of course, those political actors who are representative of a given nation state are not going to agree because it contradicts their own power base. So they can be ignored.
Under your proposal, what would happen to the current physical territorial space of Israel-Palestine?
That's the second point I wanted to make, Doug, that such a national identity is not associated with a given territory, as in the case of the Indigenous nations of Canada, which have been recognized in particular by Quebec and British Columbia. So there can be a concept of national cultural territorial autonomy applied as well, in particular to the Black nation in the United States, to those territories in which the Black people are a majority. This can become an autonomous territorial entity in a future reconfiguration of the American Constituent Assembly. However, in this case, the only sort of, separations of populations that one can point to in Palestine are the northern regions of Israel, where there's a majority Palestinian population, and in Tel Aviv, where there's a majority, Jewish population. All the rest is mixed. And the Palestinian refugees could return to those territories in which they had been resident previously, which are not populated by the Jewish Israeli population, because 80% of the Jewish Israeli population is congregated around Tel Aviv and its suburbs. So,
well, even then, that's changing fast too, isn't it? I mean, northern Tel Aviv is pretty Arab and Muslim at this point, isn't it?
I don't know.
Yeah.
I know more about Palestine than I know about Israel, actually, because that's where I've lived, for many years, for half the year in each case. And I first started going to Palestine in 2003 after Rachel Corrie was killed. And I worked with the International Solidarity Movement in the Balata refugee camp, when at that time, there was this complete occupation, military occupation under the Prime Minister Sharon, who was supposedly not allowed to be a prime minister by the Commission of Inquiry that investigated the massacre that he organized in the Sabra Shatila refugee camp in Lebanon. At that time, in Nablus, there were blockades, set up by the military not to allow transit, over the main Jerusalem Street, thoroughfare, in the city. The refugee camp of Balata had its Market Street, blocked off on either end, by big, mounds of earth and stones that were placed there by the military. And we went out and we took these obstructions down. And this was followed through by the mayor of Nablus, who took away the main blockage there on the Jerusalem Street. So we make progress, and all of this, like on the ground, work that I've been doing and that others have been doing, and together with the Israeli opposition, together with the Jewish opposition in North America, which is now quite prominent, Jewish Voice for Peace in particular, Not in Our Name, Bend the Arc, and the others. There's so many, like Jewish, activist organizations now, which are not Zionist. Jewish Voice for Peace, which has now proclaimed itself to be anti-Zionist, who would be very amenable to such a federation, and they would consider it to be a solution. However, it's very difficult to get through some of the blockages. I should mention there's been a recent division, organizational division in the Jewish opposition movement between those who accept the Zionist definition of Israel as being a Jewish nation state, who accept the B'Tselem and Human Rights Watch designation of Jewish supremacy, who accept the other sort of uses of the national definition of Jewish, and the tendency which I represent, which is the Jewish Women's tendency, which considers Jewishness not to be synonymous with Zionism and Israel. So we refuse to accept the notion of a Jewish nation state. We do not consider Israel to be a Jewish nation state. We consider it to be a Zionist state, which happens to be Jewish because some Jewish people are Zionists. But to call it a Jewish nation state is an ideological proposition, which we do not agree with. We do not accept. We do not accept the designation that this is Jewish apartheid. We do not accept the term Jewish supremacy. We consider such a designation to be essentially anti-Semitic, because it is blaming the Jewish people for what Zionism has done. Even though a majority of Jewish people don't live in Israel, a majority of people consequently do not have a vote in the Israel elections that are called Jewish. So yet we're considered to be obliged to follow the government of Israel and whatever it does. We're supposed to defend whatever the government of Israel does. We do not accept this. So we are splitting from the Jewish opposition that continues to attack Zionism as if it were Jewish. This is a very serious division of opinion. And so I've split from the Jews Who Speak Out list and Stan Heller, who has the Struggle cable TV news network in Connecticut and New York. And it's a serious, weakening of the Jewish opposition, but I consider it to be a necessary division that has to uphold the defense of the Jewish national identity and the oppression of the Jewish people, which continues and which is now being used by those anti-Zionists who consider Zionism to be essentially Jewish and who therefore attack Jewish people as such. This we oppose.
Amy, how many people do you think agree with you? 0.1% of all Jews, or what?
Oh no, there have been polls that have been conducted now which indicate that 43% of the Jewish Israeli population are opposed to the occupation, and the majority of the Jewish Americans are opposed to the occupation. So basically that's opposition to Zionism, whether it identifies itself as such or not.
Would it be fair to call your proposal a dual state solution?
No, I avoid the term state because state, is associated with the concept of sovereignty.
No, I use singular, dual state solution.
It cannot be a state if both nations are recognized. And if each nation recognizes the other, they cannot have a common state. It has to be a federal system. Because
what would the UN call it? A country or what?
A country, yes, of course, a country. But it wouldn't be a state, it would be a federation. Now, there's some indications on how to use the term from Rousseau, but Rousseau
the UN doesn't have any such thing, right? I mean, you'd have to invent a new critter.
Okay, the UN has recognized Palestine as a state, an observer state. It sits as an observer state in the General Assembly. So there's a contradiction in the structure of nations, obviously.
And to be fair, the UN created the sovereign states of Israel and Palestine in 1947, and I'm always interested to hear creative ideas of getting beyond the Westphalian notion of the nation state. So I enjoy the thought exercises of this type of speculation. It's hard to imagine any existing sovereign state canceling itself. We've had or the UN wanting to go back on the resolutions that it's back for 80 years. I mean, we've had 3 periods in the last century when the United Nations or the international community have agreed to create a sovereign nation state in order to protect a specific population from pending genocide, which was the creation of Armenia, the creation of Israel, and the creation of Kosovo. And all three have been difficult because they were nations created and internationally recognized in places that have multi-ethnic, multi-religious populations, and protecting the other populations in Armenia, Israel, and Kosovo has been more difficult. And of course, in the case of Israel-Palestine, the agreement from 1947 was to create 2 parallel states with Jerusalem as a shared capital, and that remains international law. what you're suggesting is interesting because it provides a framework. I hate to say this, but idealistic proposals are often more useful from the perspective of pragmatists in terms of being able to shift the dial in a certain direction. And does your proposal, if it were to gain more air, would it inadvertently help justify the huge expansion of Israeli Jewish settlements during the last 10 or 15 years? The reversal of which was done to a much lesser extent in Gaza in 2005, the reversal of which would require an acknowledgement of the continued international law recognition of two sovereign states as a beginning negotiating point. Do you worry that if your thinking were to gain ground, it would help justify the continued presence of those settlements? I wonder if moving away from a two-state view of things would remove the impetus for future Israeli governments to retreat from settlements as the beginning point toward negotiating a renewed peace process.
The settlements are not an impediment to such a solution in and of itself, and a solution which I call the no-state solution. Okay, there's one state, two-state solution. So now we have, a no-state solution available. And in view of the bankruptcy of the first two propositions, it lends credence to the third proposition, the no-state solution. Now, considering this in a general, universal format, the United Nations has 194 states, member states, okay. But sociologically speaking, there are 3,000 nations in the world. So there's a basic contradiction here. The logical consequence of the nation-state concept and its sovereignty is that each sovereign nation-state that exists now, all will have to be divided into their own constituent nation-states in order to represent the nationalities that are represented therein, if that pattern is to be followed. And so there would be a never-ending division of nation-states into further nation-states. So logically, it doesn't hold, and eventually will have to be overcome. Now, to overcome it, one implements the Bundes concept of national cultural autonomy. And this was developed by necessity because, the Jewish nationality was always, existing as a minority and always treated, with the disdain, by the various nation states in which it existed. And so the solution was, and also the Jewish people living in those states, considered those countries to be their homeland. Like my parents considered themselves to be Polish, and Poland was their homeland. Russian Jewish people were Russian. Canadians who are Jewish are also Canadians, etc., etc. So how do you represent, this consciousness, which is the ultimate determinant? And the only way to do so is national cultural autonomy. So you have a constituent assembly which remodels every given state, to be representative of its constituent population by implementing national cultural autonomy. So it is not merely speculation. It's not merely a theoretical proposition. It becomes a necessity after a while. And we all know that this provides us, this is a certain inevitability as a result. So I would defend my proposition on that basis, in addition to the fact that the Palestinians are agreeable to such a proposition. The settlements that have been implanted in the West Bank would have to respect, the law. What does the law say? Well, the law says that title deed, holds, so that all the Palestinians that I interviewed that had title deed from the Ottoman Empire, that I, did a video Zoom in my interviews, with, on their documentation, proves that they are the owners of various, pockets of land that have been taken over by the settlements, and they would have to be restored on the basis of law. Now, those lands that do not have, private Palestinian owners, therefore can be sort of, claimed, by settlers if they're doing so in a semi-legal fashion. But those settlers who have committed crimes like the settler that I saw kill a Palestinian during a demonstration in Hawara, who I videoed shooting from the back of his car because he was blocked by demonstrators. Well, that guy has to either submit, to the law or go into exile. He's a murderer. And other settlers who are murderers and who are members of fascist gangs that go and attack Palestinians, burn their fields, burn their olive groves, etc., committing crimes which have to be subjected to legal consequences. And Dr. Salita, the Palestinian professor who examined, the location of the Palestinian villages that were expelled, has concluded that it's possible to reinstitute, the Palestinian villages with their inhabitants, the refugee inhabitants, in return, without dislodging the most of the Jewish Israeli population. This would affect, ironically, mostly the left-wing kibbutzim of Israel, who took over the best Palestinian lands, of course. And they were the greatest criminals of all, even though they didn't call for the expulsion of the Palestinians. They nonetheless took advantage of it. And they would be the ones to suffer most for the return of the refugees to their indigenous villages.
What bothers me is I'm an old-fashioned liberal who have always tried to be colorblind and just oriented towards citizenship, and I've been anti-tribal as much as possible. I want to forget ethnicity. I don't want to have anything to do with ethnicity, and the idea of building it into the system really just puts me off. You're trying to reify race and ethnicity. I don't like that.
There's nothing wrong with your view. It's just that, for an oppressed nationality, it's not possible. One cannot forget that one is Jewish because one is attacked for being Jewish. Right now, Jewish people are being attacked by the white supremacists in the United States. And they're also being attacked now by the anti-Zionist activists, some anti-Zionist activists, who consider that they're guilty because Israel is a Jewish state, supposedly. So they consider that it's appropriate to attack Jewish people in order to attack, have some sort of effect upon, the state of Israel.
Okay, but this really it could take us into a whole thing about this critical race theory and so on, which is in a way building a whole theoretical structure on the notion that people have inherently some sort of identity, group identity, can't get over it, and therefore we have to acknowledge it and fight for our own ethnic identity, etc. And this whole current debate about critical race theory really, it really rubs me wrong. I just want to be a human, and that's all. And when people start talking about group identity, it just, the goal is to exactly get over that.
But Meta, I think you need to distinguish between group identity by deliberate assertion and choice and group identity forced upon people and peoples beyond their control. I mean, the Jewish experience is a bit unique in this sense, in that it was a disparate group of people who viewed themselves as being Polish or German or French or British, who were forced by circumstance to be defined as a Jewish nation through exclusion, through purges and so on. I mean, it was interesting living in Germany to realize both about Germany and Poland in the 20th century before the 1930s, that the national culture of both Germany, it wasn't like there was Germany and there were Jews in Germany. German culture was Jewish culture until the 1930s. I mean, so much of it was. philosophically, musically, politically, everything, and in Poland as well. That the violence of the cultural exclusion created people who had to self-define. And I would say that in terms of the current, overheated debates about racial theory, I think the basis behind a lot of this stuff is that you do have African American populations who were forced to be Black as an identity by outsiders, not necessarily with their will. It wasn't the identity you have. Now, I don't want to really get into that debate now that's become sort of an intergenerational debate about whether people should embrace and take on identities that were imposed upon them by racists. I'll give you a little example. We recently won a little argument with the style guide editors of the Globe and Mail to spell the word anti-Semitic without a capital S. Because the notion of Semites which was a euphemism for Jews from the 19th century based on linguistic mythology, was created by racists, right? I mean, the anti-Semitism is the word that exists for Jew hatred, but the concept of a Semite is a racist concept. It was invented by racists. So we argued that to capitalize the S gives false reality to a mythic concept. And I suspect for a lot of Jews, for a lot of Black Americans, and so on, it becomes a matter of, for a lot of Muslims in the world, it becomes a matter of, this may not be the thing I want to be, but it's the identity that the world has forced upon me. And do I make the most of it, or do I try to dodge it?
I sympathize with your position, because I don't use the term, and I would dissociate, from critical race theory on the basis that it's using the term race. Race, it doesn't exist. It's a 19th century concept that was used as a synonym by the imperial powers, colonial powers, to mean nation.
Let me just say where I'm coming from. I mean, almost the day I was 18 years old, I moved into an interracial co-op in Berkeley, California. And it was, in those days, in 1949, that was a bold thing to do. And everybody I knew in that organization, I've stayed in touch, and it was always, the goal was to get over race, not to try to make it into a system for fighting a war or a conflict or defending or anything. It was like trying to pretend we didn't notice the difference between different races. And I still believe that that's the way to go. And I can't help it. That's just, and all of the Blacks that I was friends with then and remained friends with the rest of my life have the same view. As a matter of fact, so would Martin Luther King. I think he would be horrified by the position that's being taken as a way to fight against racism. It's, the way to fight against racism is to, overlook race.
Well,
can I just say we need to have an interview with Meta about living in a multiracial co-op in 1949 in Berkeley. I did not know that aspect of your biography. I'll have to interview you at length about that, not to mention all the other things that happened to you in Berkeley over the next couple decades.
Yeah.
There's two methods of overcoming the problematic that Meta has presented. Okay. There's assimilation, which I think is the name of the proposition that you're making. And there is dual identity. Dual identity is possible because a person can have the national identity of two different entities. One, the country in which they're living in as their homeland, and two, the national minority from which they are derived from and from which they are labeled. Assimilation, on the other hand, has not worked historically. One example, in Spain, before 1492, the Jewish people in Spain actually converted to being Catholic in order to assimilate. But this was not accepted after 1492, and they were either executed or expelled by Queen Isabella. Two, German Jewish assimilation, which was very advanced, was suddenly cut off and rejected as a dual identity, even though the Jewish identity was restricted to the domestic location, to the home. You could be Jewish at home, but you couldn't be Jewish outside of the home. This assimilation also has failed with the Nazi extermination campaign.
Well, okay, look, it depends on what you mean by assimilation. If you look at the rate of intermarriage, is that assimilation? Okay, well, I don't know then.
I've met plenty of families in Israel and West Bank who are mixed, who are both Jewish and Muslim, or various combinations involving Christian, Jewish, and Muslim. How do they fall into this system?
The children have assumed a dual identity. So in effect, it means an augmentation of Jewish American community and not a diminution of the Jewish American community, but it is an identity that is not the same as before. I use an analogy or a metaphor to describe this, because if you consider a national identity, a national culture, to be like a river with a flowing stream of water. Now, the river is always the river, but the water is never the same. The national identity always exists, but in each generation, it changes. National identity is not static. And a dual identity is one aspect of this changing national identity.
I mean, I would argue that even for specific individuals, you have a different culture at different points in your life. I was pointing out that my grandfather's culture was as alien to mine as somebody in Riyadh is to me, and in fact, it's very similar in terms of certain aspects of roles of men and women and so on. That said, in nuts and bolts terms, under your no state proposal, somebody who was of mixed identity, who governs them?
Oh, in the resolution 181, there's a paragraph there pointed out by Dr. Ray Davis that says that Palestinians and Jewish people living in the land can adopt the citizenship of either the Palestine political authority or the Israeli political authority. So it doesn't matter where they live.
Or both? Can you have dual citizen? No.
No, to adopt Palestinian citizenship, and they would vote in the Palestinian election, even though they were living in Israel. And vice
My
versa.
solution is I want everybody to adopt both. I want to be, I'm an American and Canadian. And if I could also be Israeli and Palestinian and a few other things, I would do it. And I think that would be the best solution of all. Aaron's gone. I don't know what happened to Aaron, and we never got Adam. So it's going to be but I think the title of this show may be something like the one state solution. I mean, the no state solution.
Thank you for taking the time to outline your thinking on this, Abraham. It was a pleasure.
This is a rather rare opportunity that I should congratulate Meta for.
Thanks
Thank
so
you,
much,
Meta.
both of you.
Thank
Okay, take care. Bye.